Welcome, fellow collectors. These are exciting times in U.S. numismatics, as always. There's always new areas of numismatics to explore that haven't really been explored before intently by collectors. And when I started out in the United States, cameo proof coins struck after World War II. That was a new area to most people. There were a few dealers that were studying this field, but it was pretty much an unknown. And so when I started studying this field in the early 1980s and started working on my book, one of the things I wanted to do was note all the top cameo varieties in the Franklin half dollar series, because it was really obvious, especially when you get in the 1950s, that some cameo dies were superior to others. And what's happened in the meantime, and the book came out about 25 years ago. And so now we have cameo and ultra cameo designations at NGC, and PC just has their deep cameo designation. And what I've been working with NGC on for about the past year was on these top Franklin cameo die varieties that I noted in my first book. And NGC is finally, after studying the field and educating themselves, they are now recognizing these top cameo dies on these cameo Franklins. For example, the first 1950 I have pictured in the book on this book here, Cameo and Beryllia Proof Coinage. That when NGC refers to a cameo die number, for example, this 1950 here, Tomaska cameo die number 1, they're talking about, when you turn to page 35, the first cameo die pictured here, number 1, is that cameo die. Okay? That's one of the top 1950 cameo dies for the 1950. It's a graded proof 65 star ultra cameo. I'm going to be talking about it in another presentation. But this presentation is mainly to talk about the cameo die varieties. Now I've got a couple 1952s here, and this is a very interesting point I want to make about this. Just because it's a top cameo die doesn't mean it's going to be an ultra cameo. So here you have two 1952s. One is graded 7 star and one is graded 6.6 ultra cameo. Well, this 6.6 ultra cameo is ultra cameo because it has ultra cameo contrast on both the obverse and the reverse. One of the few 1952 dies to have that cameo contrast on both sides, and that's what makes 1952 such a rare coin in ultra cameo, because there are very few really heavy cameo obverse reverse 1952 Franklin dies. In fact, the Roosevelt dime for 1952 suffers from the same malady, because there really are no really super heavy cameo obverse reverse 1952 Roosevelt dime dies. The finest known die is a mismatched cameo die, where the obverse early strikes feature a really nice ultra cameo obverse, but a reverse that's only heavy. So the 1952 Roosevelt happens to be the only date that NGC has yet to grade in ultra cameo. Now this 1952 is really interesting because this is one of the top dies as well. It's die number 14 in the book, and it's only graded 67 star. It's not graded ultra cameo, and this is a really important point. We always consider this one of the top dies because the obverse is really the most phenomenal cameo obverse on a 1952 Franklin. The reverse, though, is just, in this case, it has some nice frost to it, but it's just a moderate frost. I have seen some examples that actually graded 6.7 star cameo, but nothing that grades ultra cameo because, again, of the reverse. But we always noted, I always considered it, when I wrote this book, an ultra cameo because they had an okay reverse, but just a phenomenal obverse. And so I kind of weighted the coin for the phenomenal cameo obverse. And when I wrote, it's very important to understand that when I put my population estimates in my book, that was the standard I used. So that when you see the population estimates for the number of 1952s graded in ultra cameo, you'll see my estimate is between 200 and 400 coins. Now that's a very high number, because if you look at the latest NGC population number, 1952 is graded 6.5 Ultra or higher. They've only graded 23 coins. And PC just about the same number, just a couple dozen coins, so about 40 to 50 total. And again, that's because of a slightly different standard that those services decided to use that differed slightly from the standard I used when I made my estimates in this book. Lastly, last point I want to make. There are some years where the die struck more top Ultra Cameo coins than others. And the most notable is the year 1956. And here's a 1956 Cameo die number 31 in the book. Now this die, what's noteworthy about the year 1956 is that the top Cameo dies struck a lot more exceptional cameos before the die began to show evidence of wear and before that frost began to fade. So you got a lot more cameos, or really nice Ultra cameos struck per die pair than you did in other years. Here's die number 31. For example, 57, the top dies, they struck some exceptional Ultra cameos, but far fewer 57s survived in Ultra cameo. These dies struck far fewer coins with Ultra cameo contrast than in 56. And in 58, far fewer still. In other words, the cameo contrast, as you got into the late 1950s, the cameo contrast on the new cameo dies wore at a much quicker rate as you go from the year 1956 to the year 1959. And then the trend reverses in the year 1960 when you start seeing more Ultra cameo 1960 Franklins. But from 1956 to 1959, each year there are fewer and fewer Ultra cameo Franklins. And that's something I noted in my book, and if you look at the latest NGC or PCGS population numbers, you'll see that fact borne out. And I'm kind of proud of that this book was written before there was an Ultra cameo or deep cameo designation, and now the population reports bear out the evidence that I worked on in the study for my first book. But the final point is, why was that happening? Why were these dies striking fewer and fewer cameos as you went into the late 50s? And my theory is has to do with the quality of the master die. The master die is the die that's used to strike all the working dies. And it was first used in 1948 for the striking of the Mint State Franklins. And as you went on through the 1948-49 through the decade of the 1950s, this master die was striking all these working dies. And as you got into the mid-50s, you began to notice significant areas of deterioration in the detail of the Franklin half dollars being struck, because the working dies from the mid-50s to the late 50s didn't have the same amount of detail as those working dies from 1950 and earlier, when that master die was brand new in its most unworn state. When you got into the mid-50s and later, that master die was showing significant evidence of wear in the loss of detail in Franklin's hair and on the Liberty Bell. So my theory is the Mint was quite aware of this, and so perhaps in an effort to preserve as much detail as they could on these proof dies in the late 1950s, they spent less time putting these proof dies in their nitric acid 95% alcohol bath to create that cameo effect. That acid bath would only cause more deterioration of detail, and so they shortened that acid bath time to, again, preserve the detail as best possible. And then in 1960, the trend reversed because the Mint undertook an effort to restore the lost detail on the Franklin half dollar, and they re-etched the dies to give them that original look from 1948, restoring all that lost detail. So when you see 1960 Mint State improved Franklins, you'll see a lot more detail in Franklin's hair, etc., than you'll see on 1959 Franklins, because there was a new master die used in 1960, a restored, reworked master die. However, there's one last point about this new master die. The one area where they apparently did not restore the detail as much as they could have were in the bell lines on the reverse of the Franklins. The bell lines on this new master die were not as deeply etched as the original master die, and so you find full bell line Franklins from 1960 to 1963 sometimes much more difficult to come by, simply because of the fact that this new master die did not have those bell lines as deeply etched into their surface as the original master die. So anyhow, this has been a little bit longer than I originally intended. A lot of information in here, but it's good stuff, good to hold on to, because again, you'll be seeing more and more Franklins with these Tomaska die designations that note the top cameo dies from the Franklin half dollars. Are especially important for those early Franklins from 1950 to 1960, when you had a lot of variability in the quality of the cameo dies during those early years. So it's been an area of study of mine now for, over 35 years. I love it as much today as I did when I saw my first cameo Franklin. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching.